I'd like to welcome you to the public meeting for the Irving Street site. My name is Asha Sethi, and I'm a public participation specialist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. I'll be facilitating the public input portion of this meeting and encourage you to provide us with feedback. It's been almost a year since we last met to discuss 2550 Irving, and since then we've been busy working to better understand what's going on in your neighborhood. I have a few opening announcements to get us started. This meeting is being recorded, and in just a few minutes, we will include a link to the presentation in the meeting chat, which you can find in the toolbar below, so that way you can follow along in the PDF if that would be of help. You've all entered with cameras and mics turned off. We do have Cantonese interpretation available for this meeting. To select the language option, you click on the globe interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and select Chinese. Live transcription is available. You'll click on the CC icon in the toolbar if you'd like to see the subtitle. And now I'd like to introduce you to the other DTSC staff that will be a part of tonight's presentation. First, we have Whit Smith, who's a unit supervisor in the cleanup program. Can you say hi, Whit? And then we have Parag Shah, who's the interim project manager for the Irving Street site. Can you say hi, Parag? And next we have Dr. Vivek Mathrani, who's a toxicologist in the cleanup program. Can you say hi, Vivek? And finally, we have Ted Mazzoli, who's a geologist in the cleanup program. Can you say hi, Ted?
Good evening, everyone.
Great. Well, that's our project team. Thank you all. Next slide, please. Now I'll go over how to participate in this Zoom webinar. There's two ways you can participate. During the presentation, you can type a question by clicking on the Q&A icon in the toolbar. We'll also take questions using the raise hand icon in the toolbar when it's time for public input. When we call on you, you'll be able to unmute yourself at that time. And for anyone calling in on the Zoom line, you can raise your hand by dialing *9, and then when you're called on to unmute yourself, you'll have to dial *6. For anyone calling in on the Cantonese line, they'll communicate through the Cantonese interpreter. His name is Vila Wong, who you can see interpreting, and I'll be checking on her periodically. We'll alternate between phone callers, Q&As typed in, and those that have raised hands in the order we receive them. In case we encounter any technical difficulties, we ask for your patience. And if you're unfamiliar using Zoom webinar, we'll do our best to assist you. My colleague Alejandro Vivas is also assisting on the back end. We did just hear today that there's a computer update that will be running between 7 and 8, and we don't expect this to cause an interruption, but just in case it does, check back on the same link in 15 minutes after, and we'll resume from there. Next slide, please.
Oh, should we have a hand raised?
Oh, okay.
Mr. Adam Michaels.
Yeah, let me just get to this next slide here with the agenda, and then I'll see what Adam has to say. Now I'll go over the agenda for this meeting. The presentation does have a lot of technical content in order to address the types of questions the project team has been receiving. But please don't hesitate to speak up if you'd like us to spend more time defining the terms that are being used. We want to make sure that everyone can follow along. And if you're mostly interested in the takeaways, there is a set of summary slides at the end of the presentation. So Whit will start off with a Dtsc overview. Then Whit, Parag, and Ted will present information about the investigations for the Irving Street site. Vivek will present information about DTSC's risk assessment process. And then here we'll have an opportunity for public input so that we can hear from you on the content just presented. And just wanted to say thanks to Flo with the Mid-Sunset Neighborhood Association for that suggestion. And then the final portion of the presentation will continue with a discussion of the anticipated program for the Irving Street sites and conclude with a set of summary slides. We'll have the remainder of the time to engage in discussion with you. And that's it for opening announcements. And was there something else, Adam, before I hand it over to Whit for the presentation?
No, I was just trying to leave my hand up so that when...
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. Okay, you're number one on the list. Gotcha. Okay, now I'd like to hand it over to Whit for the presentation.
Good evening, all. I'm Whitney Smith, the unit supervisor for the Irving Street Sites program. I wanted to apologize for our unit's kind of limited capacity at present and our slow response to public inquiries. We have had 50 to 25% vacancy over the last 2.5 years since I joined, but our staffing trends have improved lately, and we just received a tentative acceptance for one of our positions today that we've been trying to fill for over a year. So this is great news for Parag and I and our team. Arthur Machado, the prior PM that you'd worked with previously, left service at DTSC for a different state agency late April. Parag has been ramping up on these projects. Our team has been working on historical studies of the area and continue to work on investigation activities with responsible parties. We are excited to be back in a public meeting with you and to be sharing information on updates from the last few months and to hear the community's concerns and ideas. For that, let's begin with a reminder about DTSC's role within the state regulatory system. DTSC is responsible for the evaluation and oversight of contaminated properties throughout the state. We are funded principally by responsible parties. We are required to collect costs of oversight from responsible parties rather than from taxpayers. This results in DTSC having to have agreements or orders with each landowner operator for each property, even when projects are being overseen as part of a common program, as is this case. You may have heard assertions that DTSC needs to manage this area as one site. In point of fact, we are managing it as a single program, but we have to do it in a manner that's defined by the legislature, including agreements and orders by property so that we can track, invoice, and collect costs from individual polluting owners or operators. We also have Orphan site funding for sites where there is no responsible party existing, or responsible parties don't have adequate financial means. DTSC is allowed to use state funds under very limited conditions. DTSC management was able to arrange for a small kind of one-time allocation of state funds to complete sampling of the residents to the north of the Police Credit Union after the Police Credit Union terminated its agreement earlier this year. The response actions that we oversee are informed by environmental data and by risk assessment. Oversight of our sites may include remediation, mitigation, monitoring, determination of acceptable risk, or combinations thereof. To the extent that properties are redeveloped or developed for the first time, zoning and planning approvals are made by city and county planning agencies. DTSC has no zoning or planning authority. So I'll turn it to my colleague, Parag.
Good evening. My name is Parag. I am a chemical engineer and DTSC project manager for these sites. Happy to be here tonight. I started my transition to project manager for these sites the third week of April when my colleague Arthur left DTSC. Thank you for your patience as I learn these sites and try to prioritize this heavy workload. My responses to your inquiries have been a little slower than I would like. I look forward to completing my ramp up on these sites, catching up on various inquiries, and meeting with you more often. So with this DTSC oversight, chronologically, DTSC's involvement began with Site 3 over here, specifically with the Police Credit Union, aka TPCU, where we did a multi-phase investigation under a voluntary agreement. This property encompasses the parcel where Miracle Miracle Cleaners formerly operated. As part of work with TPCU, we investigated the Irving Street proper, shown here as Site 5, better termed Area 5. This was done as part of TPCU's voluntary agreement. Also, under TPCU's voluntary agreement, we investigated 6 residents to the north, shown here as Site 1A, better termed Area 1A. Work is ongoing and has been done with limited state funds following TPCU terminating its voluntary agreement. TPCU's voluntary agreement also included investigation at Site 1B, better named Area 1B, which is an empty parking lot located on the south end of the 2500 block of Irving. As will be discussed later, we are expecting a new voluntary agreement with the future buyer to continue work on the site ahead of the planned mixed-use building to be built on this lot. Near the end of our work with TPCU, we began planning for a soil vapor investigation near and exterior to residents to south and southwest of former Albright Cleaners, Area Site 2. That work did not materialize with TPCU, but it is being resumed with Albright's responsible party. TPCU then sold Site 3 to Tndc, which entered a CLARA agreement with DTSC and is planning on redeveloping the site as a low-income housing with vapor intrusion mitigation integral to the building design and operation. As mentioned above, Site 2 is the former Albright Cleaner site. Originally a voluntary agreement, DTSC switched to an order because the investigation was not proceeding briskly enough. DTSC has only one type of order in our toolkit that we use, whether a site represents relatively low or high risk, in this case, relatively low. Use of our order instrument automatically triggers Cortese listing, even if the site is relatively low risk, such as this one. Finally, over here on the bottom right is Site 4, which is 1300 26th Avenue, also a voluntary agreement. Historical information reviewed to date does not indicate PCE use for historical operations at this site. Rather, this is an example of a responsible party working with us, not because they have a potential release, but rather because they want to proactively and conservatively work with DTSC to confirm their building has no vapor intrusion issues or manages vapor intrusion appropriately. Next slide. Back to you, Wood.
Thank you, Parag. So this slide summarizes much of the sites and the regulatory frameworks and the nature of agreements that Parag just touched on. Just want to touch on the CLARA again for the Tenderloin, the TNDC. So this is a regulatory framework, a separate framework from the rest of the sites. This CLARA framework was enacted by the California legislature in 2004 to encourage the purchase and then redevelopment of brownfield sites by parties that did not formally pollute the site. There's sometimes concern by banks that are financing properties or new buyers to enter into and upgrade and improve the brownfield sites within city urban areas. I also want to note that not all of these properties, as Parag mentioned earlier, are agreements for properties that use PCE historically. Some are merely working with us to check that their building air quality is safe and adequate as a conservative cautionary practice. Some of these agreements and orders are for properties that had business operations that formally use PCE. However, not every business that has historically used PCE resulted in releases or even significant releases from facility operations. So our evolving site characterization and growing data set will kind of guide us as to what scenario has occurred on these sites. And I wanted to just touch on, so again, as we manage these sites as a single program, the fact that the legislature has, four or five mutually exclusive regulatory pathways within which DTSC can operate sites. Sometimes there are legislated regulatory differences that we have to manage that on the surface make the sites appear more disjointed, but programmatically DTSC is trying to integrate them and work them together as best we can. Some of the sites will have different frameworks. We have to invoice individual parties. Some of the sites have different objectives, such as the case of 26th Avenue, where they're just prudentially confirming safe conditions for their occupants. Turn it back to Parag.
Thank you, Whit. So discuss the activities since our last community meeting. July 2021 was the last community meeting for the draft 2550 Irving Street response plan. Then in September of 2021, we approved the response plan for 2550 Irving Street. Same month, we sampled 6 residences north of TPCU for indoor air, outdoor air, and soil vapor. That was done by TPCU in March. Did the same exact sampling again. In April of 2022, we sampled the former Albright cleaners for soil and soil vapor. That same month, April of 2022, we entered a new voluntary agreement with 1300 26th Avenue. In May and June, DTSC had scoping meetings with Albright cleaners team for phase 1 and a potential phase 2 work plan. Back to you, Whit.
Right. Kind of an overview of investigations to date. Tetrachloroethylene, which we'll be terming PCE for the rest of the meeting, is the primary contaminant of concern. It's commonly used in dry cleaning operations, and it's being phased out in California for dry cleaning, but will still be present in some consumer products. Consumers will still be able to purchase, use, and store these PCE-containing products in their homes. It's also difficult to prevent residential users from disposing of such liquid products down their toilet if they so choose. Based on test data to date, residents are safe to occupy with respect to PCE, including for sensitive populations such as children and the elderly. DTSC does not expect to see adverse health effects based on levels of PCE that have been measured in indoor air to date. Evidence of PCE release source areas have not been found yet at the Police Credit Union nor the former Albright cleaners. We are seeing low levels of contaminants in those sites, but not what we would typically see as a source area. Investigations are ongoing, though. When we consider lines of evidence on the distribution of PCE across the sites in the Irving Street area, we see that PCE is most concentrated within the Irving Street right-of-way being the public roadbed of the street and the adjoining sidewalks. This pattern suggests that PCE may have been historically discharged into the sewer system, and we will expand on that later. So, in terms of the status of our search for PC source areas, no pure PC liquid has been found in soils, nor concentrated PC source areas in soil or groundwater, nor signals of such, have been found thus far. The kinds of groundwater, soil, and soil vapor concentrations that we've measured thus far are orders of magnitude lower than what we normally see for source areas from the PCE release. But as I said earlier, investigation continues, and we'll follow the data. DTSC is searching for source areas that may require remediation. I'm commonly be called cleanup, or that may require mitigation, limit exposure by, say, engineering controls built into new construction. And ideally, that can be tied to a responsible party for cost recovery. And source areas may include PC liquid, or areas that have higher concentrations of PC in groundwater or soil, including concentrations that are assessed as being above the risk management range, including areas that may have sources that are evolving into soil vapor and causing soil vapor concentrations above the risk management range. To go through some of the technologies and kind of the path forward on our site characterization, in particular looking for PC source areas, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ted.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time. Ted Mazzoli, I'm geologist DTSC in Berkeley, and I've met a few of you when I was working out in the neighborhood, and I'm looking forward to working with you on this project. So we have lines of evidence used to find PCE source areas. The source areas have not yet been found at the Police Credit Union where the former Miracle Cleaners was located, and nor at Albright Cleaners. Typical lines of evidence we use for finding pure PCE or source areas during the characterization are soil samples, which are so far non-detect for PCE. Groundwater samples, we've only had one detection of PCE, and it's below regulatory levels for drinking water. Deeper, approximately 15 feet below ground soil vapor samples. And then vertical profiling instruments, it's called a membrane interface probe with a halogen specific detector, or MIP, and then also other lines of evidence. Next slide. Next steps for the former Albright Cleaners. The draft 1 investigation, the draft phase 1 investigation report for former Albright Cleaners is due on July 1st. So far, no source area has been identified, as I was saying. Soil samples have no PCE, and soil vapor levels are similar to those north of Irving Street. Coming up, we have the Albright Phase 2 investigation. This would consist of determining alignment and condition of piping, using a video of the sewer lateral interior down to Irving Street. We'd screen and sample the sewer gas within those pipes for PC vapor. We would review the historical sewer networks for the neighborhood, especially east on Irving, and also building department files for Albright. Our requested phase 3 investigation would involve replacing and resampling the blocked deep soil vapor probe at Albright. We install a new permanent groundwater monitoring well in front of the Albright Cleaners, the former Albright Cleaners. Be out front, slightly down gradient of the building. A MIP survey for looking for a source area adjacent to Albright to the west, south, east, and possibly under the sewer lateral on Irving Street. And finally, exterior permanent soil vapor probe sampling near the residences southeast and south. I say finally, but maybe others, but yeah. Thank you. What? What, you're muted?
Here we go. All right. Thank you, Ted. couple clarifications. One, in the last two scoping meetings we've had with the Albright responsible party and consultants, we've requested, and we understand we have concurrence on advancing to indoor air sampling for that mixed commercial residential building. And the step out exterior permanent soil vapor probe sampling that we've requested south of Albright would extend south and southwest, not southeast. Okay.
Thanks, Whit. Sorry, I
Sort of,
misspoke on that.
Yep. Sort of summarizing some of the historical work we've done recently. Just to start off, we wanted to note that the deeper PC soil vapor, when we look at the overall data set, is concentrated around Irving Street, suggesting a possible association with the sewer system. We will show you a figure depicting that later in the presentation. Potential PC discharges in the sewer system would be consistent with one, the relatively low concentrations of PC and soil vapor that we're seeing here compared to typical PC release sites in the Bay Area. And two, that the highest concentrations of PC and deeper soil vapor in the right of way rather than, under a former operating building footprint on a private parcel. The current sewer system is shown above in green. My family and yours, live in this city where neighborhoods have at least a century of commercial activity, sometimes decades more. And some of our residential neighborhoods in San Francisco have prior decades of actual industrial land use. That's not the case here, but other neighborhoods, have a prior industrial history. We've had sewers in San Francisco long before we had regulation of the industrial chemicals that were used by preceding generations of our city's bustling commerce. Historical businesses may have discharged PC into wastewater or in other liquid forms from the beginning of the neighborhood in the 1910s until the Clean Water Act of 1972 or the Federal Hazardous Waste Laws of 1980 were enacted, implemented, and became mature regulatory systems. So there is
sorry to interrupt. We had a comment to ask you to speak louder if you can, or bring your mic in closer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. We potentially have, decades of operations where PC might have been discharged as part of wastewater or as another form of liquid from businesses before some of these federal regulatory laws were passed in the 70s and 80s. It is also, hard to regulate homeowners even today from discharging pharmaceuticals or liquid consumer products down the toilet. So that's sort of an ongoing issue for sewer systems in general. Over the decades, these sewer systems get replaced. They get wider to add capacity. Their routing and flow directions may change, all to keep pace with the growth of neighborhoods. And over 100 plus years, or over the many decades of operation, despite the best inspection or repair efforts of the Public Works Department, we do have earthquakes, we do have tree roots that burrow into pipe joints, and we have other factors that can damage sewer lines via cracking, offset, separation, and other failure modes. It can result in localized short-term releases of wastewater, including potentially wastewater with minor process wastewater components. It's possible that those could have contained PC at some past location, at some locations and sometimes in the past within the local sewer network. It's hard to document this or demonstrate it, but it's possible, perhaps even probable, given that the neighborhood has had many businesses discharging over almost a century to the sewer system. Historical PC discharge to the sewer system is one of the hypotheses that DTSC is carrying in its evolving conceptual site model of the study area. Historical PC discharge and to the sewer system and leakage from the sewer system, would be consistent with some of the patterns we see of deeper soil gas having a signature that's most concentrated in the middle of the street, and that the concentrations are relatively dilute compared to what we typically see for a release from a dry cleaning facility, leaving a source area on site. DTSC has requested that one of the responsible parties start obtaining historical sewer network maps from 1910 to the present. That request is already in with Public Works. This particular area does not have digital as-builts available today, so that's in process from Public Works Archives. Currently, the existing sewer system flows in kind of north to south columns as you move across Irving Street. So for the subject block, wastewater and stormwater enter the sewer system and flow east to west, and then the blocks immediately to the south and north do the same, and then they come together in a north-south alignment that flows northward toward the park. We haven't looked at what the downstream network looks like, but that's the general pattern, and it replicates block to block to block as you move east to west along the Irving Street area. In decades past, however, these sewer networks might have had different configurations and different flow directions. So in order to kind of connect historical business operations that may have used PCE, in a wider radius around the neighborhood, we also need to be able to connect them hydraulically by understanding how the historical networks were laid out and flowed for the neighborhood sewers. DTSC's been reviewing historical businesses in the area so that we can try to identify historical business operations that may have discharged historically to the sewer network. DTSC is exploring historical sewer network configurations, as I mentioned earlier, to understand what businesses may have been hydraulically connected to this area of Irving Street. And we will discuss some of those historical business operations in the next slide. All right, this is a busy figure. I'm going to jump to the following slide 14. This slide has my talking points about the prior graphic, which may save you some from having to busily take notes. And our team will make this presentation available to the community. So I will be going over these points, but while we look at the preceding slide. All right. So this is our desktop effort to try to better contextualize potential PC releases in the neighborhood at large. This is closer to a neighborhood scale desktop assessment using available data sources. This initial DTSC review covers about 18 block lengths of streets and 12 plus city square blocks centered around the 2500 Irving Street block. We shared this analysis with state elected officials, staff on May 12th, and with San Francisco Department of Public Health and MSNA representatives on May 27th. The sources that we used include city historical directories, aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, 6 state databases drawn from 3 state agencies, San Francisco Department of Public Health's GIS system, and other materials. The information that's available for any particular parcel kind of varies as you move across the study area of consideration. So not all parcels have equal available information. it's somewhat hit and miss, but we've tried to corral and integrate, synthesize that data in this first pass. This is a preliminary analysis. DTSC may refine it in the future, depending on the results of other testing and desktop studies that we are overseeing and coordinating from the various sites. The sites that are currently overseen by DTSC are indicated with the red border. To get oriented, north is upward here. The groundwater flow direction that moves beneath the neighborhood at a depth of about 80 plus feet is to the northwest. So groundwater is flowing in that direction. Black dash line, gray dash lines indicate different data sets that were available, the different data sets that we reviewed. Yellow areas indicate commercial, retail, and parking areas, either original construction or that replace residences that were later demolished over the development life of the neighborhood. Each of these small scale squares is an individual parcel. The year of original building construction is indicated in numerically by year for these sites. Orange areas indicate historical businesses likely to have used PCE. We have arrows without orange highlighting for kind of secondary businesses that might but are unlikely to have used PCE. We don't want to lose those either, but they're of less interest in the overall analysis. So most of the buildings in the neighborhood were, the original residences, typically constructed from the 1910s to the late 1920s, some buildings in the 30s, and then a few late infills. Most of the historical business operations associated with PC are located along Irving Street, as indicated here. We do have one former dry cleaner to the north. To the east, we have several types of businesses that were likely to have used PC, and those range from service stations through dry cleaners to printing facilities. There is a former printing facility located, on the 5200 block. We did want to present this historical context to inform, the interpretation of data, environmental data as we generate it, to kind of guide us better on future investigation design and to identify, potentially responsible parties to bring into the program if needed. One of the encouraging findings is that this preliminary study has found very few potential PC sources in sort of a general operational sense from business history to the north or the west or the south. These results are not complete, they're not definitive, but they are encouraging in terms of confounding factors and other sorts of PCE that could potentially be found on this side of the neighborhood. And I just wanted to reiterate again that not all the data sources that we applied were available at every portion of the neighborhood. So at a high level, qualitatively, we appear to have many fewer potential businesses in this area, and very few of them appear to be likely to have used PC historically, which gives us a little more confidence when we're doing step-out sampling and designing subsequent phases of investigation. So these are kind of high-level summaries of the content I just gave you. We're next going to step into the earlier discussion about deeper soil gas. Ted mentioned earlier lines of evidence to look for source areas of PCE. Of those lines of evidence, look for and infer PC source areas. One of the strongest ones we have in our data set right now is deep soil vapor. Deep soil vapor means, depending on the probe, typically 12 to 15 feet below ground surface. We just normally call the cutoff 8 feet here. So we're terming deep, 8 feet or deeper. We'll look at shallow soil vapor on the next slide. This is a strong line of evidence for looking for source areas. One, because it's deeper, so it's expected to be spatially closer to a hypothetical PCE release. PCE is a liquid that's denser than water, and when released in a beach sand type matrix like this, it would tend to migrate vertically under its own weight, potentially displacing, water that's in the pores between the sands, and making its way down to the water table where those pores are full of water. What we call the water table in common parlance. And because this soil vapor at the deep horizon is further from the surface, it has less mixing and influence from atmospheric air exchange that comes from weather-induced barometric pressure changes. This figure shows the cloud of PC vapor in the beach sand under the neighborhood, specifically the concentration of PC in soil vapor. Each of these lines represents a common concentration. The most concentrated deep soil vapor signature is located, within the street, within this red line circle. This represents 2,000 micrograms per meter cubed, or higher levels, inward. As you step out, each ring represents a progressively lower concentration. There does appear to be a dip and then a pickup again here, like the concentrations go down and then increase again. But there's preciously little data here to really rely on that interpretation, and we'll explore that more as we potentially build this data out with the 1326th Avenue responsible party. This analysis is prepared by combining every soil vapor probe that has been tested in the deep horizon across the various programs over time, as well as temporary soil vapor probes that are more than 15 feet from permanent. If they're co-located, we prefer the permanent data. Once this data is all posted, we use a geostatistical modeling package to use computer analysis to combine all the data and weight it equally under assumed conditions, and have the computer kind of guide us to the least biased interpretation. And then we try to vet it with professional judgment and make sure it's clear. We dash it where things are less certain. This analysis is not strictly accurate from a time perspective. Some of these measurements could be taken months apart. Some of them could be taken, a year or two, or a year or more apart. But we expect that releases that occurred years ago, decades ago even, in a highly permeable beach sand matrix would be largely stable by this point in time. And in fact, when we look at the data set for these residents to the north, we have almost a year and a half of data for these. We're seeing very stable trends for these 6 deeper probes over that year and a half period, which sort of corroborates the idea of the plume is probably relatively stable at this point. Again, we need more data to confirm that, but the early data we have seems to suggest it. So with a stable data set, we're comfortable with this temporal inaccuracy in order to get the richest number of spatial points to help us infer the spatial patterns of PC at the site. So the soil vapor signatures in beach sand should be relatively expansive. You know, a hypothetical historical PC release would have moved down through the beach sand. It would continue to evaporate in the beach sand, and the evaporated vapor would move by diffusion and by pressure effects from weather change, and would generally move away from what the most concentrated area is, with declining concentrations as it moves away. Because we're in a beach sand environment, the signal from historical PC releases should be relatively expansive laterally when compared to other types of typical Bay Area geology, such as soils or clays. That is, we don't think you need to exactly be over PC release in order to detect a signal from it, because vapor moves so easily laterally through this permeable beach sand matrix. Based on this analysis, we're finding generally low concentrations of PCE compared to what we see in other communities and other sites in the Bay Area. These levels are 100 to 10,000 times lower than what we're used to seeing for PC release source areas. This is also true, maybe 100-fold lower for kind of the typical groundwater levels we'd see at a release area. We've got limited groundwater data, but at this site, but it's much lower than we're used to seeing for releases. In addition, while these concentrations are all low in a general sense, the relatively highest levels are in the street rather than under the historical operating footprints of the two dry cleaners. So, this existing line of evidence of the composited data, does not suggest a source area at either Albright or at the former Miracle Cleaners within the Police Credit Union property, but investigation continues.
Whit, I had a question from Paul on this particular slide. I wonder if it'd be possible for you to answer that while we're on it. He wanted to know, why don't you contour to your own screening level?
Oh, I guess we could. The data. Yeah, we could add that. That would be fine.
Thank you.
I mean, ultimately, whatever the contour says, I mean, these data points are going to kind of lead us to step out further to the south. I think to the north, often we'll stop the exterior soil gas investigations once we've gone indoors and confirmed that those levels are safe. But I think we'd be happy to amend this to show screening levels, to the extent that they fit within the view pane here. I don't think we want to lose the spatial resolution, but we can add that as a takeaway for a future meeting. Did Paul have a follow-up question?
I think we should continue on because we still have a good portion of the meeting to go here, and we want to hear from others as well. So
great. Okay. Anyway,
going.
so those are what the current data set sort of indicate, but investigations continuing. This is a very similar analysis, but this is for shallow soil vapor, typically at a 5 foot below ground surface horizon. The types of levels we're seeing in PC are very similar across both sides of the street. There's one high point that was measured. I mean, it's low in a global sense across the Bay Area. It's the high point within this data set, and that one point does throw contour. It strongly influences the contouring, even though it's only 1 point. Normally, we like to see contours that are based on, many data points. We should have an opportunity, as Parag said earlier, to get more data with a forthcoming voluntary agreement with the future buyer of this parcel. And that would help us kind of confirm whether this is typical or maybe unrepresentative, and just give us more data in this area to improve and make these contours more robust.
I received another question from Joan about a particular soil vapor probe 28B. I don't know if it's on this figure or previous figure, but I wonder if it's accessible, if you could just point it out.
28B would be up here.
Okay, and she says it has shown fluctuating data that is counter to the argument that the plume is stable.
Okay. Maybe when we get to Q&A, I can pull up a draft figure that shows. So what I said that it was the deeper soil vapor probes were stable, but I think I have a figure that shows 18 months of data for 28B that we can perhaps pull up if Q&A time allows.
Okay, sounds good.
So if the team would remind me if I forget to attend to Joan's question, that would be appreciated. Back to the shallow horizon, these results are less useful for inferring if or where there might be a PC source area at depth. We look to the deeper data on the prior slide for that. Rather, the shallow data is more important for informing vapor intrusion assessment for existing buildings in the neighborhood. My colleague, Dr. Mithrani, will now address our soil vapor intrusion assessment process and share information on recent test data for this assessment program.
Thanks, Whit. Hello, everyone. My name is Vivek Mithrani. I'm the DTSC project toxicologist and risk assessor. When we talk about a risk assessment, we need some measure of what the potential exposure is to someone who is breathing the contaminant of concern. The contaminant of concern we're talking about here today is perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene, which is a volatile organic compound. So to get that measure of exposure, the route of exposure is inhalation. And that exposure pathway for vapor intrusion specifically addresses contamination in soil gas, which may be coming from soil, may be coming from the sewer line, or may be coming from dissolved contamination in underlying groundwater. Because PCE is volatile, it can waft up through the soil column underneath the home, through the air spaces, and if the foundation lacks integrity, through cracks in the foundation and impact indoor air quality. The way we measure how much is in indoor air is using something called a SUMA canister, which is essentially an evacuated stainless steel ball that holds about 6 liters. A vacuum is pulled on it and then it's sealed. We place that SUMA canister inside a home and open up the valve so that it can suck in air in the indoor air. The SUMA canister does not distinguish where PCE is coming from. It is pulling in everything that is floating around in air. But the thing is, PCE may come from other sources, including indoor consumer products or from outdoor air, in addition to vapor intrusion. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we are doing a vapor intrusion investigation, we have to take steps to make sure that we are getting a better measure of vapor intrusion contribution to indoor air quality, because that's the pathway that DTSC is charged with managing. If we're seeing a signal from something else other than vapor intrusion, it's going to be a lot harder to think of a vapor mitigation system that's going to address that indoor air concentration. Next slide, please. So that said, I just want to call your attention to the Consumer Product Information Database, which is publicly available, and the website is shown below. These are potential contributors to indoor air volatile organic compounds, among which PCE is one of them. So you can look up tetrachloroethylene in the database and find that it lists 51 brands that contain PCE. And if you don't mind clicking, And those consumer products include stain remover, adhesives, silver polish, and automotive cleaners. So what we need to do ahead of a vapor intrusion investigation is remove such products from the indoor space so that when we are collecting indoor air and sending that sample to a laboratory, we are not seeing contributions of PCE from any of these products. This is the irony of a vapor intrusion investigation, that we are looking for contaminants of concern that to date we can buy over the counter. Next slide, please. The other component of a risk assessment is the toxicity of the chemical. And the toxicity is reflected in the indoor air screening level that we've established for screening risk at a site and prompting our risk management framework at DTSC. The indoor air screening level targets the most sensitive health endpoint, that being cancer, below which adverse effects are not expected. That being said, it considers the range of possible health effects that are associated with PCE from epidemiological data or animal data and selects the lowest concentration that elicited an effect or at a particular level of concern. The indoor air screening level for residents assumes a continuous exposure of 24 hours per day, 350 days per year, from ages 0 to 26 years. The 0 to 26 is to cover critical developmental milestones in case there are any sensitive endpoints during childhood. The product of the 24 hours, 350 days from 0 to 26 years reflects a total number of hours in a lifetime that somebody is breathing PCE. That being said, if one was to spend less time in their home during the day regularly, the same risk would be experienced and tolerated for a longer period of time. That is, if you only spend 12 hours a day in your home, 52 years it would elicit the same level of risk calculated. The health risk at the screening level is often an overestimate of true inhalation risk because we have aspired to overestimate all the values in the risk equation so that the conservatism and overestimation compounds, and the final number that we get for a risk calculation can be seen as extremely protective of human health. Furthermore, the value that we calculate is often very small compared to other background risk factors. That is, if we are looking at something on one in a million range to 1 in 10,000 range, which is the risk management range, this is still several orders of magnitude, or 1,000 to 10,000 fold smaller than what background risk is for cancer. The screening level, once again, targets the most sensitive endpoint. And this generates the most stringent screening level for all potential adverse health effects. Actually, the screening level that we are using for cancer, which is 0.46 micrograms per meter cubed of PCE in indoor air for residences, the next most stringent screening level for PCE for liver effects is actually 42 micrograms per meter cubed, which is about 100 times higher. So by this process and this approach to screening, managing PCE concentrations for cancer risk protects from non-cancer health effects related to PCE as well. Those being, for example, neurological, developmental, etc. Also, I should point out that California's PCE screening level is the most stringent in the country. Were this a federal site and federal EPA were overseeing it, they would screen indoor residential air at 11 micrograms per meter cubed, which is 24 times higher than the DTSC screening level that is applied to inform our risk management decision process. Next slide, please. Going to the Police Credit Union offsite residential indoor air study for PCE, there were 6 homes that were tested. There were 2 testing events, one in September 2021 and one in March 2022. The September 2021 event tested indoor air quality without altering the ventilation status of the homes, in that windows were left cracked open and essentially left the way the owner had left under quote unquote what was called typical conditions. So there weren't extra steps taken to control the influence of outdoor air. More so, consumer products were clearly influencing the indoor air quality in some of the residences based on the results that we got. Moving on to the March 2022 sampling event, very cognizant of what we saw in September 2021, the windows were sealed to remove the influence of outdoor air diluting indoor air concentrations. And also consumer products that were suspected to have PCE were removed from the homes. That led to a decrease in indoor air PCE concentrations in 2 of the homes. And those decreases left to concentrations below our residential indoor air screening levels. So that provided a line of evidence that vapor intrusion was not occurring. In the 4 other homes, we actually saw an increase in indoor PCE concentrations. But in 2 of those homes, labeled number 3 and 4 over here, we saw other volatile organic compounds that were indicative that maybe consumer products were not identified, or maybe something was off-gassing and contributing to indoor air quality. So we weren't certain, even though PCE concentrations had gone up, we're still not sure what the major contribution to that indoor air quality is, whether it's consumer products or vapor intrusion. Homes 5 and 6 also saw an increase in indoor PCE concentrations, and we didn't see strong signals for consumer products. So the conclusion was that the March 2022 event showed evidence for vapor intrusion in 2 of the homes. Nonetheless, all 4 of the homes that exceeded the residential screening level in March 2022 were assessed at the low end of the risk management range for risk management decisions. And I'll go a little bit more into that later. Next slide, please. Just to summarize the table that was presented in the previous slide, the March 2022 sampling event reduced the influence of outdoor air, which would lead to dilution of indoor air PCE, and remove consumer products, which can often lead to false positives when we measure PCE from the lab. Indoor air PCE was reduced and below screening levels in 2 of the residences. In 4 of the residences, it was increased and above screening levels. 2 of those residents had evidence for vapor intrusion. We couldn't ascribe it to any other source. 2 other residences had possible evidence for vapor intrusion, but a weak indication that possibly consumer products were contributing to the PCE detections. All the results were in the low risk management range for those 4 residences that didn't screen out. Next slide, please. From the 4-step process from our 2020 draft supplemental vapor intrusion guidance, we've run through the process for the police credit union offsite properties and prioritizing buildings in proximity to the source contamination for a VI assessment. Exterior soil gas samples were collected to determine if the buildings have potential for vapor intrusion. Indoor air, outdoor air were collected to evaluate potential VI risks, and they were collected in 2 different sampling events. And we're at a point now, which Whit will talk about evaluating the need to manage current and future vapor intrusion risk based on both indoor air concentrations and soil gas concentrations. And the link for the supplemental vapor intrusion guidance, which is still draft, is on our public website, and the link is below. Next slide, please. And this risk management decision framework for vapor intrusion also comes out of that guidance. It provides 3 different tiers based on current vapor intrusion risk that is estimated primarily using indoor air data. It also provides guidance and potential response actions for future vapor intrusion risk, estimated primarily using subslab or soil gas data. And I will allow Whit to explain the path going forward and explain how this framework will apply to this neighborhood. Thank you.
I think we're going to break for public input now. I know there's folks very eager to ask questions. And let's start off with Adam first. He's been waiting very patiently.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My house was one of the 6 tested twice for PCE vapor, and I speak for the 6 the households, we all had PCE vapor intrusion in our homes, as you noted, well above the screening levels. TNDC wants to make sure that its residents are safe at 2550 Irving, so it's planning to put a vapor barrier under the building. And that's great, but it only protects people in that building. They're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this, so the levels of PCEs are obviously not harmless in their view. There's a reason that they're putting the barrier. And many of us live very close to that building. So my conclusion is that there must be a risk to human health or they wouldn't be putting the barrier. But what about the safety of the people who live close to 2550? You say it's safe, but geologist Don Moore told us, there is a source that can be remediated. It's this, you had a contour map yourself, Mr. Smith, that showed basically a bullseye where that red circle was on Irving Street. And there is technology that exists to remove that gas. It's soil vapor extraction. Why not do your duty as a public agency and remove that poison gas so that we don't have to continue breathing it in our homes? Is that too much to ask?
Thanks for your question.
Yeah, I understand that DTSC has cleaned up other neighborhoods with the same level of PCEs. So why not use soil vapor extraction? You know where it's highest, right there on Irving Street. You could extract it after the building's demolished, and it would improve the health of the whole neighborhood. Why not go ahead and do that?
Thanks for the question, Adam. Whit, would you like to take that?
Yes, thank you. So this is the figure that Adam was referring to. So we have a process that we're required to follow statutorily. We'll talk about that more later in the slide, later in the slide deck. Before we can select a remedy to clean up a source area, we have to first complete site characterization. This to us does not say we found the source of PCE for the neighborhood. We have additional data that we have to obtain, and we really should obtain, concentrated PCE that we're trying to clean up in soil. So customarily, when we use PCE, or when we use soil vapor extraction, we're treating an actual source area. I can show you some example slides. This is a site where we don't have a decision document yet. But it appears that we'll be using a combination of soil vapor extraction and mass excavation. But I just want to show you that the kinds of concentrations that we would apply that to are 160,000. And when we find what we think is a source, we're looking at 14 million, not 1,500. So our concern in jumping in and throwing a remedy in place where we haven't defined the sources, that we would just be sucking in a cloud that's emanating from a source that could be further afield. Like there's a fire burning in a forest away from your tent. You take a hairdryer and blow the smoke away from your tent. The fire at distance is not extinguished. The smoke is just going to regenerate and come back over the area. these aren't levels that we would associate with a source. We haven't found a source yet. To remediate something by any number of technologies, whether it's SV or ISCO or mass excavation or other technologies that can be used for PCE, we have to find the source, and we're not there yet. I think that's the first consideration. And we may well find it down the road, but we're not at a point where we've characterized things. And then once characterization is complete, the next step that our process requires is risk assessment. Often you have low levels of contamination and no source is ever found in the end. But if those low levels are demonstrably of acceptable risk, then we wouldn't treat, A, because there's not significant risk, and B, we haven't actually found the source, and we can put a system in, run it for 3 months, suck up a bunch of vapor, it'll look clean, demobilize the equipment, and then over the coming months and years, this plume would reestablish because we haven't found the source area. Particularly if we find the source area is related to a linear feature like a former sanitary sewer line, randomly dropping some soil vapor extraction wells in this area, may be unlikely to do more than remove this cloud for a short period of time. It would not be a permanent remedy. And long-term effectiveness of a remedy is one of the formal criteria we have to demonstrate when we select a remedy for implementation. So one reason is we're not there in the process. 2, we haven't fully characterized the area. 3, we haven't fully conducted risk assessment. And we really need to find a true source area. Otherwise, this gas cloud could reestablish over time after the short-term ineffective remedy is executed. I don't know if my colleagues in geology or risk had anything they want, or Prague, you wanted to add anything?
I think that's good because we've got a lot of other hands raised.
Okay. Should I take Joan's earlier question before we forget about? Should I take Joan's earlier question, the first question?
If you've got the map up, you might as well, and then we'll go. Next hand up is Layla. We'll go to Layla next, and then we'll take a Q&A after.
If Layla could hold till I get the figure and address Joan's earlier question, that would be appreciated.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Go. So this is a preliminary figure for the deeper. Oh, these are the shallow profiles. I'm sorry, Joan, I don't have the deeper ones with me. These are the shallow ones. This comprises just under 18 months of data. Of course, one could look and maybe find one that's trending upward. I think the red one is, but just as you could flip a penny once and get tails and conclude that every time you flip the coin, it's going to be tails. If you get more data points over time, more locations, you develop a statistical picture. And I think most people looking at this diagram would conclude that, at least at the shallow horizon, concentrations are predominantly stable or declining. And I apologize that I don't have the deeper profile. I don't have the figure for the deeper profile.
Okay, so that's something that we can get back to
her later.
Okay,
yep.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay.
So this demonstrates, at least over an 18-month time frame, stable to declining trends in soil vapor.
All right, thank you. Okay, Layla, thanks so much for your patience. Go ahead.
Hi.
Oh, we've got some feedback on your end there.
Can you hear me?
Looks like we've still got the feedback. You could try typing in the Q&A or I'm not sure what else we can recommend here.
Does this work?
Oh, perfect. Yes, thank you.
All right, perfect. So my family, including my 2 children and 2 of my senior parents, we live in one of the homes that are close to this contamination and has been tested for the PCE vapor intrusion. And according to what I read and heard, there are other sites in the state of California managed by the Water Board and DTSC that are using the 10 to the minus 6 as an action level to remediate, mitigate. And I understand that the action level is that at the DTSC's discretion in this particular case, but also in this particular situation, we have sensitive population, children, elderly people, decades of exposure potentially to these toxic vapors, that were possibly previously higher in concentrations. We have 100-year-old homes with crumbling foundations, and it will only get worse with time. So my question is, why in our case you're not committing to using the most conservative level, the 10 to the minus 6 as the action level, which would be consistent with the other sites in California and which, would ensure all the necessary remediation or mitigation or both. And it would provide, best, most conservative, best long-term protection for our health and health of other residents in the neighborhood, including our children.
Thanks, Layla.
Thank you for that. I don't think I think our presentation to the 6 homeowners was very clear that we cannot be pre-decisional, right? We haven't committed either way. We can't legally commit until we've completed characterization, completed risk assessment, have completed a decision document that follows our process, and that decision document has been through public comment. What we try to do, because homeowners are concerned, is signal what a typical management approach might be for a site of this type. And that's as much as we've signaled thus far in the meeting that we held with the homeowners in the past, and as you will see later in this presentation. Just an aside, and then Layla, I'll get back to your question. We're at the midpoint of our presentation. The back half will talk more about risk management and kind of the typical path forward. So as the audience members who are queued up right now to give us questions consider the nature of their question, perhaps people could hold questions on risk management and treatment and some of those things that are kind of end of the arc, because those may be better asked and responded to after the second half of our presentation is given. Whereas if people have questions that are more related to characterization, current data, results thus far for the indoor air, things that are related to the first half of the presentations that's been given, that may be a more constructive use of our collective time here.
Okay, that sounds good. So just, hang in there, Layla. We'll circle back to your question after the second half of the presentation.
Okay, and I'll make a note. And again, colleagues, please remind me. And let's start with Layla's question when we get to the second set of interrogatories.
All right. Now I'm going to take a couple of Q&As. The first one is from Shane, and I'm going to go ahead and put it up so that everybody can see his inquiry here.
Do I need to stop sharing, Asha, or do you have
No, you're good.
Control?
I'm just going to go ahead and read it aloud. Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
So Shane wants to know, why are only 6 homes at the north being tested? Is there a plan to test more homes in the area? At this time, it still looks unclear how far the contamination reaches into the neighborhood. And I believe the step-out sampling in residential areas was recommended by the police credit union's consultant, but it never occurred.
Dr. Mithrani, do you want to talk about, it's sort of between within the VI risk assessment framework, did you want to comment on how far we typically step out in terms of kind of phase 2 exterior soil vapor sampling for screening, and then going indoors for indoor air, and the process by which we kind of determine we're far enough, everything outboard appears safe. This is the finish line. Everything inward gets managed differently.
Yeah, well, per guidance, we're charged with stepping out and characterizing to our screening levels for soil vapor. And this, I think, what needs to be factored in is prioritization. Based on resources and time. That through our 4-step process, the prioritization would consider the proximity to the presumed source area or the area of highest concern. I wouldn't say necessarily that these ISO concentrations are the say-all, end-all. I mean, we know that step outs are warranted. We have fairly favorable data outside, acknowledging that they're above the screening levels that are established by the draft 2020 supplemental vapor intrusion guidance. But I will also tell the attendees that one of the reasons that vapor intrusion guidance is still in draft form, because we might be actually revising the default attenuation factor that informs the screening level. And we might be instituting a California-specific attenuation factor to screen soil vapor. And that may lead to a soil vapor screening concentration that's maybe 5 to 6-fold higher than what we were screening when we started in this offsite vapor intrusion investigation.
Okay, thank you, Vivek. And then the next Q&A is from Paul. He wants to know, what is your source for 1202 26th Avenue as a dry cleaners until the 2010s? He's never seen it, and he's lived there since 2004.
You go back to, okay, Paul, Asha, could you repeat the address that Paul gave us? Paul, do you have, or Asha, do you have the address that Paul put in the inquiry?
Yes,
I didn't catch
sorry
the number.
about that. Yeah, let me just get that up.
The short answer is I don't have that at my fingertips. We've got tons of binders and tons of documents we comb through, and I will have to get back to him on that.
So
it may well be a city business directory that goes back to the 1950s or something. Okay. But let me get the address first so we can connect him with that information.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, it's the I'm sorry, it's the 1202 26th.
That's right.
Okay, sorry, Asha.
And so, okay, we'll get back to you on that one, Paul. And now I just want to pause and see.
I'm sorry, Asha, I just wanted to capture the question. So he wanted to know what is the source or the source for that inference?
Just looking to see where that question went. If one of the other panelists can find it and read it, that would be great.
Well, I'm going to take it away as Paul wants the source or the sources that historically the references that suggest that that's potentially a former dry cleaning facility at 1202 26th Avenue. And if I mischaracterize that, if Paul could kindly
according to the question, I think you're correct. What is this? Yes.
Great.
What is the reference?
Perfect.
What was that, Ted? Could you recap?
Paul was asking for the reference for determining how long the dry cleaner was there.
Okay. All right. And now I just want to check in with our interpreter and see if we have any questions on the Chinese line. Vila, you can just nod your head yes or shake your head no. That probably is going to be easier than you switching over. Okay, hang on. Let me switch over. Vila, we can't hear you, so let me get over to the Chinese line. Oh, okay, all right. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, and now I just want to do a time check because this presentation is taking a bit longer than we expected it to, and it is 8 o'clock, and it was another half hour that we had scheduled. And so we have another chunk of the presentation to get through. And so now we need to see if there's an interest. If people want to stay longer, if we go until 9 o'clock, then we can get through the other half the presentation and take more questions. And then what we'd have to do is we'd have to get back to those of you that we weren't able to respond to this evening. And then we can also pick this up again at a later meeting. So we have a number of options here, and I think that given that not everyone's going to be able to stick around, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows it is going to be recorded. I think that we should just go ahead and do the second session of this presentation. There is one other question that we had related to this first presentation from Jean Mai, said that she does. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question right now, Jean, before we finish the other portion of the presentation? Alejandro, could you unmute Jean Mai?
Hello?
Okay, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I have a question. We keep on mentioning the source. I understand that if you can find the source, then you can really fix the problem, right? So then my question is, why can't we find the source? If there's some existing of that gas there, that chemical there, it must came from somewhere. Are we doing enough to find the source? I mean, it's not growing out of tree, right? So we know it's there somehow. So I'm just kind of puzzled that why can't you find the source? And also, I'm not too great with all that, charts, but I do remember you say that statistical data, all those report, where you build up all those like surrounding the graph, the bullseye graph. Those are being taken at different times, right? Over the year or whatever data. So my question is, wouldn't it be better to test all the areas at consistent time all at once to get that? So that, let's say in winter, like this area has more and that area has less, right? If you take them at different time, different season, to me, I'm not a scientist, but it just doesn't make sense because the weather could change. I mean, if you want a truly good, data point, you should test things all at the same time. I mean, we're only talking about a few blocks you're doing. I live 2 blocks away, and I could tell you, my across the street neighbor, he just turned 50, and he got diagnosed with brain tumor, and he's dying. There's no cure. And then my mom had cancer a couple of years ago. My stepdad died of cancer. So now I start to question like how extended this is. So I am very curious, and also, what you mentioned earlier, like, on one of the graph is like, if you're doing 24/7 in the house, for the past 2 years, pandemic, everyone's staying in the house. I'm working from home, so does that put people in more danger? And how long do we know if this is going to happen again, right? I mean, what if there's another way people are staying in? So does that make it more dangerous if you're, staying home all the time and you're breathing in this gas?
For your question, Jean.
Sorry, it's too many questions, but I'm curious. I have a lot more, but I'll just stick with this right now. If you could, let me know why is this so difficult to find the source?
All right. I'm going to start with number 2 while we're on the slide. So I think your second question was, why don't we sample them all at the same time? And you're absolutely right. That would be the absolute best data that we could get. But for example, some of these probes are temporary probes. They no longer exist, potentially. And it's sometimes difficult for us to get access to go through all of these different entities at the same time. We no longer have the police credit union engaged for sampling these areas. DTSC has very limited state funds that we're using for the final round here. So it's a combination of, are all the stakeholders still available? Do we have funding sources for everything? Not all the probes exist. So that's the constraint that prevents us from sampling every probe at the same time. There's just cost, logistics, available parties. Some of the probes no longer exist. So that's the answer. So in that context, and if you go back at the slide, I explicitly state that this is not representative temporally, but where we do look at temporal data for individual probes, there's a fair amount of stability. So given that we can't have both, if we're looking at an analysis to try to understand where the contamination is located, we think the best use of data, if we can't get all locations at the same time, is to compile and mosaic the latest existing data for each point. Understanding that that's not perfect temporally, but in the context of, but because we can have it perfectly, and because data appears to be relatively stable in time, that appears to be the next best way to infer where the source may be, so that we can then go in and try to do additional investigations to locate it. To your first question of, so, could be this source, 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 could be the former hardware store here, could be some of these coming down an old sewer alignment that doesn't exist anymore, could be stuff flowing from further to the south through the sewer lines. There's a lot of possibilities, a lot of error, and there's a lot of possibilities, a lot of area. And it takes a lot of expertise. It takes some luck. It takes a lot of historical research. It takes iterative sampling. I wish I could wave a magic wand and zero in and say it's right here at 30 feet below ground surface and was released in 1976. But the reality is that it's going to take us a while to get there, Gene. So we beg your patience and your cooperation, and we will hopefully be advancing on this and find at least a first source in the coming months or this year. To your third question, you started talking about, in the context, if you look across California, I think there's a 2019 study that was issued by the governor. The average lifetime cancer rate in California is 4 out of 10 people. This is more Dr. Mathrani's bailiwick than mine, but I think what you're saying is when you consider the people that you're observing some occurrences of cancer, possibly in older acquaintances, and it's making you apprehensive that they may be experiencing their cancers, even though the background rate is about 40% statewide, 2019 data, that these particular people are not experiencing sort of 40% probability, but it's related to the PCE. So was that kind of the question of that third set of comments, Gene? Gene, we're not hearing you. We're not hearing you. So,
Alejandro, could you open up Gene's mic again?
or assuming I paraphrased it correctly, Vivek, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that. I mean, you're all about the data moving forward, and it's hard to really discuss things retrospectively without data. But I don't know if you had anything to contextualize.
Right, that's a perspective that I share, that and a limitation of our process, that we're managing what we measure. Right. So with the site characterization data, with the indoor air concentrations measured, and also trying to discern in those indoor air concentration, what is contributing the PC to that detection? Is it vapor intrusion? Is it from a consumer product, which we clearly had a signal for in the first sampling event, right? The body doesn't distinguish PCE, where it's coming from. It doesn't care, right? But the thing is, I will also point out, which I've responded to in the chat for some of the questions, is we have set the state of California alone has set their screening level for cancer very, very low. It's lower than any other state or federal agency in the country. So the thing is, what I'm trying to say is that most other states would not consider these PC indoor air concentrations, regardless of source, as dangerous or even prompting any sort of risk management response. So that's a consequence, and the intention on the state of California's part is to be protective. And by being protective, that means setting a level that is so low that it prompts some sort of response, further characterization, monitoring, repeated sampling, et cetera, and engaging in community participation. But the thing is, when we set levels low, we also are measuring and looking for small signals where we have other things in indoor air that might be contributing to that signal. And it makes it a little bit harder to interpret the data. That's why we have to do multiple sampling events, because we need to, regardless of where PC is coming from, we're going to breathe it. Right. But the thing is, for DTSC's purposes, to manage vapor intrusion risk, so the risk of vapors coming from underneath a home into indoor air, we need to make sure that it's coming from underneath the building. Because the thing is, if we automatically assume that that data point is entirely from vapor intrusion and don't consider other sources, no level of remediation or mitigation is going to fix that indoor air concentration. Because the thing is, we haven't addressed the source. We haven't addressed where that indoor air quality is being impacted from. And that's what the two sampling events also highlighted, that in the one home where we had indoor air concentrations of PC and TC way higher than screening levels, in the second sampling event, when consumer products were removed, that home actually screened out below our residential screening level for PC.
Right. Thank you, Vivek.
And then I think Jean's fourth question was, she was just concerned that, the last 2 years with COVID, she's been home, closer to 24 hours a day. So I think her general question is, we've started getting data at these sites 2019, 2020, 2021. You talked to her, maybe you could just recap for her again, kind of the overall hours of exposure that are built into our very conservative, low 1 in a million cancer risk kind of screening levels, and just kind of give her a sense of if you're home full time for 2 years, how many years could you be at home 12 hours a day, and just to give her just a rough sense of it, because maybe that particular highlight that you touched on, she missed in your.
Well, Gene makes a very astute point, in the context of the pandemic, that a lot of us weren't leaving our homes for some time. We're afforded the opportunity in California to go out. I grew up in New York City, and my mom has been trapped in a one-bedroom apartment for all of COVID, right? And finally able to enjoy the outdoors. But just the same, Gene, we are charged, and we use a decision framework and a screening level that is supposed to protect somebody who even elects to stay at home 24 hours a day. But it's a continuous 26 years. We're looking at chronic risk, long-term risk, not necessarily over 2 years or 3 years or something. If we were assessing risk from PC over a shorter time frame, we would be looking at much higher levels. But because we average the concentration and the body burden of PCE over a lifetime, we come up with a very, very small number, which is 0.46 micrograms per meter cubed for residential duration. But it's a very astute point that, yeah, and why shouldn't somebody elect to be in their own home if they wanted to? Those are people who we are charged with protecting, and we have a process that is designed to protect them. And it's the most protective risk assessment framework in the country.
Thanks, Vivek. Thanks, Whit. So I know that we have our second half of the presentation, goes over what the anticipated program is for the Irving Street site and concludes with some summary slides. And, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm wondering if you think there's a way you can get through those slides, or if there's maybe a subset that you want to cover, because I don't think we're going to have time to get through the entire slide deck and take additional questions. So what do you propose as far as shortening, the time you spend on the second half, or do we want to continue on with questions related to this first half of the presentation?
I think we should get the presentation done because it'll be recorded, and then the audience can refer back to it if they need it. And then perhaps some can stay late for questions at the back end. And I think that might be the sweet spot in terms of getting the best combination of content and public engagement.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for bearing with us. And we do hope that with more frequency of meetings, we'll have more opportunity to engage in dialogue, and we won't have so much information crammed
hopefully in person
into this portion of time. So just stick with us for this one, and next time we'll do better and try to make sure that we're hearing more from you than you're hearing from us. So, okay, let's just dive back in then, Whit.
Okay, back into it. Okay, so again, we're just backing up to the DTSC vapor intrusion assessment process that Vivek touched on again, just to refresh. Number one is prioritizing buildings and proximity to source areas for assessment. Two is moving toward them with soil gas samples that are taken outside of their building shell, exterior to their building, to identify which of those even have soil vapor levels that pose a screening level risk. Then collecting indoor air samples with related samples to try to address and deal with confounding factors like outdoor air, ambient air issues or indoor air issues, and then proceed to risk assessment, and then evaluate proceed to risk assessment, then proceed to risk management. So let's kind of take that four-step process and at a very high level give you a sense of where we are and where we think we're going. So in terms of prioritizing buildings for vapor intrusion, the 6 residents were identified, that's done. We've identified a first building that will help us get a sense of the cohort of mixed commercial residential buildings that are right along Irving Street, closest to the deeper soil vapor signature. And these are a different type of construction. These are not residences. They are commercial ground floor with residences above. So they represent a smaller piece of our housing stock, but a different cohort. So we've prioritized one of those for study. And then we talked about how we were gearing up earlier to work on residents to the south. We're planning on resuming that now with a new responsible party. So prioritizing those ones to the south and southwest is pending. And then we are continuing our DTSC historical reviews to kind of identify other potential sources, sewer connections, and maybe help us identify and prioritize buildings for the assessments. As we identify other buildings, we may have new responsible parties that need to be engaged as well. So step 2 in the process is the exterior soil vapor sampling. That's been concluded to the north already. And we're planning for that to the south with a new RP, picking back off of work we started a very early planning phase half a year ago now. In terms of step 3, collecting indoor air, we have the 6 residents north of TPCU. The last round under our normal indoor air testing protocol are scheduled for September 2020. That may well be concluded, or the vapor intrusion assessment piece may well be concluded in September for those buildings. The next phase of the Albright site characterization will include a work plan and an indoor air assessment for one of the mixed use buildings along the street to kind of have an indicator building for that cohort of structures. And then we will be working with one of the RPs to plan for which buildings we move toward with this step 2, step out soil vapor sampling nearer to but outside of buildings to the south and southwest. So look for that in the coming months and later this year. Step 4 is management of current and future VI risks. So for the former police credit union parcel, that site has been through a decision document and it has an engineering control that's been planned, through that decision document, including land use covenants that will help protect that engineered system and require that similar systems be applied to future buildings that may be erected, decades hence when the new building reaches the end of its service life, as well as operation and maintenance and 5-year reviews of protectiveness. So that's for new construction at the credit union. For other sites, those don't have a decision document yet. And as we mentioned, each of those is going to require that document under our process: complete characterization, risk assessment, and then a formal evaluation, selection of remedy or mitigation or management strategy with public comment. We cannot commit to that ahead of this decision document process. If we do find source areas and they're identified, per the earlier slides of our process, typically those will be managed by remediation and or mitigation of nearby structures. And where we're identifying lower risk areas or lower risk buildings or non-source areas, we have a range of options under our guidance and our statutes. So to get a little more into the different areas of the program, so for the residents to the north, we have some indications that some of the buildings, and again, we need one more round of data, but some of those buildings may need no further action based on the data arc that we're seeing. Vivek showed 2 of those today. For the other 4, the final data may indicate that some type of risk management approach is indicated. And again, these are typical, it's pre-decisional. The department cannot legally commit to this at this point. But what would typically be done by the management for this region, for our regional geology, for sites of this type, would be to set an action level, likely for exterior soil vapor probes, now that we've correlated soil vapor exterior to indoor conditions, and monitor those for stability. And if things worsen unexpectedly, potentially move to a mitigation of the affected structures. The action level would likely be at the low end of the risk management range and would likely use either conservative attenuation factors between soil vapor and indoor air, or, if the data has been generated, empirical attenuation factors that are specific to the building, or a lot of buildings that were built at the same time have common construction, common condition. To the south of Albright, we're much early in the process. We're just beginning step 1, but as we march through that, we'd expect that the risk management approach at the end would be similar to that outlined here. For the mixed commercial residential buildings along the subject block of Irving Street, we have a little bit of step 2 data. We have some soil vapor probes in the parking lot to the west of Albright. We've selected a first building to look at for that mixed use building stock. For the new construction that may happen on that empty parking lot, it would probably be a similar approach to the TNDC development, probably an engineered control with a lot of the management documents and covenants to protect it. But for existing buildings, the approach would be, very similar risk management approach. We'll have industrial, commercial uses instead of residential at the ground floor. Ground floor commercial to residents above is a slightly different kind of analysis, but the overall framework would probably be very similar to what would typically be done for the residents to the north. For source areas that we may find in the Irving Street right-of-way itself, that's a tougher nut to crack, but early on it will be continued characterization with responsible parties that may have released or contributed to discharges to the sewer, may have released to that area or contributed to sewer discharges in that area. We would evaluate remediation if a source area is identified and confirmed, and we've kind of characterized it. And then the risk management would again, follow the step 1 to 3 process. Management of building risk would not be in the right-of-way, obviously, it would be adjoining structures. That's a little harder to see at this early juncture how that would go, but it would probably be not dissimilar. And then to our final summary of statuses sort of by sites. So for Albright, I have a train passing me, so pardon the noise. For the former Albright cleaners, the phase 1 investigation, no PC detected in soil. Soil vapor levels were generally low and similar to what we have on the north side of the street, and less than what we're observing in the street itself. Phase 2 is going to include some television work and mapping and condition of the sewer system, the private sewer lines from the building to the street, some sewer gas screening and sampling potentially, and then an indoor air assessment of the first mixed commercial residential building. And for phase 3, DTSC has requested some further activities, including stepping out toward residences to the south, out of the step 2 exterior soil vapor. That piece is still in negotiation with the responsible party. For 1326th Street, we received their historical data. We engaged them in April for an agreement. We have a meeting scheduled with them June 30th to define the next phase of their investigation. DTSC has also done a bunch of independent desktop studies on historical data to see whether we see any evidence of historical PC use at that property. We've not identified that as yet, but we will continue to keep an eye out for that as we work through them on characterizing indoor air for their building. For the vacant lot to the west of the former Albright cleaner, DTSC has notified the former owner that site conditions should be disclosed to any new buyer. There's a health and safety code section we've provided them that requires the future buyer to disclose conditions to any future tenant of a building that may be there, may be erected there in the future. And we're expecting, in the coming months, a voluntary agreement with the new buyer. And the anticipated activities are very similar to what we've probably seen at TNDC so far, although this would be under the 6.8 framework that the rest of the sites other than TNDC are operating under. Residences to the north and the south, prioritizing buildings for VI assessment. The north, that's pretty much done, but we'll see when we get to the risk assessment, but that appears to be complete. Identifying priority buildings to the south is pending, but we're engaging an RP on that. Exterior soil vapor sampling nudging closer to those buildings. The north is done, south is pending. Indoor air sampling, step 3 of our process to the north. Testing should be complete for those buildings for the indoor air assessment piece in September of this year. The south area is lagging probably a year or 2 years on, but that's pending. When each area is completed, steps 1 through 3, we'll get into the risk assessment piece with the RPs. and then into the risk management with likely or with typical outcomes, having been discussed previously in italics. Irving Street right of way, we'll continue our historical work on older business operations and trying to map out historical sewer networks, and we'll continue investigation work through responsible parties. For the mixed-use buildings along Irving Street on the subject block, we've already identified one building for the step one. There might be others down the road, but we're beginning with Albright. We have some existing data to the west. Additional data may be needed. We'll be working with the responsible parties for Albright for that. We've already agreed on a indoor air sampling for the Albright building. A work plan is pending. And again, when those first three steps conclude, we'll proceed to risk assessment and then to risk management with kind of typical outcomes as previously discussed. And then along the way, to the extent that we identify an actual source area with, liquid PCE or concentrated PCE in the subsurface where we're getting, a real ongoing source that's going to continue to recontaminate soil vapor in the area, and or we find buildings that have unacceptable risk. In those instances, we'll be moving typically toward decision documents that indicate remediation and or mitigation for surrounding affected buildings. So low-level PCE and other types of contamination from a prior century of commercial and in some case industrial activities in neighborhoods is common across the Bay Area. This area of Irving Street actually has relatively low concentrations compared to what we see in many communities, West Berkeley, West Oakland, West Richmond, other parts of San Francisco. These residences are safe to occupy right now, including sensitive receptors like the elderly and children. And DTSC does not expect to see adverse health impacts from PCE based on the levels that have been measured indoor air to date. A PCE released source area has not yet been found in the police credit union parcel, including the former Miracle Cleaners, nor the former Albright Cleaner parcel. Investigation is ongoing. PCE may have been historically discharged into the sewer system, which was legal to do historically. Strongest soil vapor signals at depth, as we showed previously, are actually in the right-of-way. That's not definitive, but it does kind of guide our model, a conceptual model, and where we may be investigating in the future. And this suggests some impacts under the street. Pardon the train noise. DTSC is managing the Irving Street sites programmatically, subject to our legislated mandate to recover costs from individual responsible parties for the properties that they formerly were owners and or operators of, and to be operating within the different regulatory silos that have been established by the state legislature for managing sites of this type. DTSC has been reviewing historical sewer networks and historical business operation data in the neighborhood. This to kind of enrich our understanding of and support interpretation of the environmental data we've generated and will generate, to help guide iterative characterization of our sites and to identify potentially other responsible parties. And DTSC will continue to work with responsible parties, both current and future. Typically under agreements, but under orders if necessary. To you, Asha.
Thank you, Whit. And sorry, I know we're past 8:30 now, and this meeting or this presentation did go a bit long. As we were talking about, there's a lot of catch up to do.
Asha, you're muted, I think.
You can't hear me?
We can hear you, Asha.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to keep going here.
The attendee might want to check the interpretation and make sure that they're on the right channel.
Right. I don't know if you can hear me and who that was speaking, but hopefully you can, or maybe you can say it. Well, you already said it, Vivek, so maybe she was able to hear you to just go over to the interpretation channel and select English and see if that helps out. So just wanted to say it was a lot of content. We're playing catch up. And had a great suggestion from Joan, and that was to perhaps consider doing a separate just Q&A session, since we've got a lot in the queue as far as Q&As, and we've still got a lot of hands raised. And so, I need to check with the project team to see if that's something we can schedule sooner rather than later. But I think that's a great suggestion, because that way, there'll be a recording of this meeting, and then we can post that so that even folks who weren't able to join can watch that recording. And then we can just, possibly commit to another session where we're just engaging in discussion, and it's not as presentation heavy. So that would be my suggestion. And then given that, we are willing to stay a little bit longer if that works for folks. We can go up until no later than 9. Let's try and wrap up maybe in the next 20 minutes and see what we can get through here. And what we can do is we can hang on to the questions that we've received and then address those in the next session. So that way you don't have to, reformulate, your comment or your question to us, so that that it's, in the system, and we'd like to address it as a group again when we reconvene. So I hope that works for folks, and please, feel free to reach out to me if you have any further suggestions. So there's just a couple more slides. Here's information for where you can access all the documents on EnviroStore for all the sites. Next slide, please. And then here's our contact information. So, and with that, I think we'll just move back into folks who've been waiting very patiently. I'm going to go to hands raised.
Asha, if we tabled Layla's question to be the first up for this section.
You want to go back to Layla's, and then I'll go back
let's
to the
first
queue.
Confirm that she can hear us. Layla, can you chime in and confirm that you've got audio for us?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. So let me paraphrase. So I think your question was, elsewhere in the state, there are communities where DTSC is using an action level of the current screening level as a basis to manage sites. Why not do that in this neighborhood? Did I capture that?
Could you turn your video back on? Sorry.
Oh,
yes.
Of course. So sorry. Okay. Layla, did I capture that?
Yeah, in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Yeah. Let's see. I believe DTSC has something on the order of 10,000 existing and legacy projects across the state. I don't doubt that there are some like that. I've been with the department just under 3 years. For the portfolio I'm working on, I don't think we've done one like that. And I obviously can't know the entire domain of what, DTSC's hundreds or 1,000 employees do across the entire state. I would say that I think it's atypical to do that. It also falls to, that's a branch manager decision. So that, the team attendees today don't make that decision. I think the general reaction from management when they've looked at the data set for the site is, the site's really not bad in the range of sites we have across the state. The teams are spending a lot of time on this relative to other sites. So, I can run that up the flagpole again, but I think in sort of the cost benefit, the relative risk, applying DTSC resources to, some sites that have maybe EJ communities and other more sensitive communities. That might be a higher level management kind of sentiment, but we can check on that. And then I think to Dr. Mathrani's point, I think we may find, it sounds like in his reading of tea leaves, there may be a point in the future where the screening levels actually go up a couple factors. Vivek or Ted or Parag, I don't know if you had any other.
I just wanted to clarify. I didn't say that it was only DTSC that had this kind of project. I said in the state of California, including managed by the Water Board.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Water Board has a completely different process. They don't follow the health and safety code. They work under the water code. It's a different body of law. We have some common guidance documents we share with them, but they have different management, different priorities. They work under a different section of the California Code of Regulations. So I think it's hard to extrapolate from there. You could equally say
it's about the same PC vapor though, and the same risks to the population, and it's the same state. So it's if they're using these kind of conservative action levels, why can't it be applied to our situation?
I understand.
Worthy for others, why can't we have it for our children?
Right. No, I understand the sentiment, and on the flip side, I think Dr. Mathrani mentioned earlier, if you were in California under a US EPA lead site, US EPA might, have much higher levels under its oversight. If you want a federal facility within the limits of California, you might have a very different experience in the opposite end under a sister agency. So I understand the sentiment. I think you have different geology across the state. You have different management. You have different agencies. So there will be some variability across thousands or tens of thousands of projects. But I think the common theme is that California approach generally is highly conservative. And in all cases, whichever regulators you're working with are, in their professional opinion, trying to provide protective conditions for your home and your family. They just may get to it a slightly different route. They may use a slightly different level, but in the scheme of it, it would still be, conservative and protective.
Thanks, Whit. I think we'll go to the next raised hand. Hal, you've been waiting really patiently. Go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. Go ahead, Hal. We can hear you.
Yeah, why did DTSC issue a secret exemption for the Npndc response plan prior to completion of an appropriate source investigation on that property? DTSC seems to be putting property redevelopment ahead of the health of the neighborhood. Is that observation incorrect?
Let's see. So yeah, it's a complicated. All right. So the state legislature created a process called CLARA to encourage purchase and redevelopment of brownfield sites within urban areas. And the party that bought the property from TPCU elected to enter a CLARA agreement. And DTSC management and legal looked at it and felt that the project met the spirit of the 2004 CLARA statute, and we entered an agreement with them. That statute exempts them from having to clean up off of their site. And within their site, they can choose to clean up or mitigate being a word for build engineering controls for the new building. All they have to do is make sure that their site is protective of their future occupants. And that's state law from our legislature from 2004, intended to try to catalyze and encourage, redevelopment inside urban cores of California. And we're simply the administrators of that state law as passed by the legislature. Now, so for that site, I forget the numbers, but I think there's a groundwater sample. There's probably a dozen soil vapor samples. I think we had 40 to 60 soil samples. I think only one had detections just above reporting limits. It sounds like there is a disagreement between some of the consultants that the community is engaged with and our staff, but we felt that the standard of practice had been met in terms of characterization for the CLARA framework, where all they have to do is characterize enough to build safe housing for their occupants. And then there's a separate initiative at the state, again, recognizing the housing crisis that we have statewide. The legislature passed Senate Bill 35 that says that 100% low-income housing projects that are built, and this is not, I'm not a planner, but 100% low, this project's 100% low-income housing. So a project like that within an area, within a brownfield, is important enough to the people of California in aggregate that the legislature waived the CEQA process for projects of that kind. So city planning waived it because of the legislative mandate under Senate Bill 35. Our CEQA document typically, like our remediation or our mitigation, is a piece of that overall development. And our CEQA determination typically tears off of the primary CEQA document. In this case, that project was exempt from CEQA under Senate Bill 35. I hope that somewhat clarifies a very complicated planning and kind of remediation and legislative process in California. We don't have simple regulations in our state. So
it's definitely not simple, but it really does seem that redevelopment really is ahead of the health of the neighborhood. And your responsibility is to maintain the health of the neighborhood.
Our responsibility is handed to us by the legislature is to maintain the health of the neighborhood with respect to illegal discharges of hazardous substances and hazardous wastes that may have been released by individual identifiable parties. We're not responsible for the cancer risk that you have from new construction on clean parcels, from diesel emissions from construction equipment. That's often a 10 to the negative fifth risk to the community on the timescale of 2 years. That's true for any new construction in an urban area. We're not responsible for that. We're not responsible for background air quality. Those are air regulators, and there's risk there. We have background soil contamination with polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons because we all used to burn coal in San Francisco. Some of those background conditions, that's typically not covered in urban areas of California that have over 100 years of occupancy. The aggregate risk that we all have in San Francisco from collective diesel emissions, whether it's ferries, trains, standby generators, the legacy diesel buses that haven't been converted over yet on Muni, those background cancer risks from transportation infrastructure, those aren't covered by us. But we live in a sea of chemicals within these urban settings part of the benefit of living in a vibrant urban setting, economically, culturally. And we are tasked with a very small set of chemicals which expose people involuntarily because they were illegally discharged. And we manage it at a risk level that's often much lower than the background risk from breathing the air, from emissions, the exposures you're allowed to have in your workplace under Cal OSHA, background cancer risk from the disinfectants that are used in water treatment that are allowed under the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act. Our risks, they sound scary sometimes, but in the scheme of societal risk, we're managing a very specific portion of the risk, a relatively small portion of the risk, and we're managing it very, very conservatively. In this instance, it may be dispersed. There may be multiple locations. They may have been released decades ago. They may be hard for us to find. We're trying to get there. It's not always easy for us to find the legacy stuff, but we're attempting to do that to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Whit. Thanks for the question, Hal. We're going to move on to Robert Ho next.
Well, and Asha, sorry, you may be on this already, but it seems like we needed to pull some questions from our Cantonese speaking audience members too.
I'm here.
I was gonna.
Perfect.
Oh, Robert. Okay, great. Go ahead, Robert.
Okay. I hear you say that you have not been able to find the PCE source in the 2550 Irving Street site and elsewhere. But at the same time, you've been saying that for the past year. I heard the same thing during the last year's community meeting. And since that time, you have not done any testing at the former Miracle Cleaning site. There's been no sampling at that area. And also, there's been no additional sampling in this middle of the contour map that you show, where clearly it has 3 samples that are very high, and they are in front. One is in front of the former Miracle Cleaners, and the other is in front of the Albright Cleaners. And you have within a year, you have not done any further sampling. So I don't understand how you can say that you cannot proceed with remediation because you have not identified a source, but at the same time, it's staring you right in the face, but you still have not done any further sampling.
Okay, a couple comments.
Thanks for the question, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. So in the right-of-way, we've got some samples that are, they are over 2,000 micrograms per meter cubed. They are, relatively speaking, the highest concentrations that we have measured in deep soil gas in the neighborhood. But in our experience, looking at hundreds and hundreds of sites across the San Francisco Bay Area, those are not high concentrations. To go to sorry, I need to trouble with my screen here. To go to some sample sites, high concentrations to us are millions of micrograms per meter cubed. This is a source area. We can see it. There's steep concentration gradients, 14 million micrograms per liter, 2 million micrograms per liter, 6 million micrograms per meter cube. I'm sorry. When we're looking at sources, we're accustomed to finding things that are 1,000, 10,000 times worse than you have here. These really are fairly low level and maybe just a few stuff from sewer lines. We haven't found what we would consider to be a source area yet. Additionally, we're obviously not going to be building housing over the street. We will be doing indoor air testing for buildings adjacent to the street, including looking at the sewer lines that connect those buildings to the right of way. And we will follow that through the process that we have outlined. These things, they take time. We're advancing with work on the Albright cleaners. We got additional soil data. We got additional soil vapor data in April of this year from them. We're working with them to plan the next phase of their investigation. We were making good progress with the police credit union. They chose to withdraw their voluntary agreement with us I can conjecture why they did that. It was unfortunate it happened. It can, if we were to re-engage them under an order, it can take us many, many, many months to issue an order. There's a lot of legal groundwork we have to do on the back end of that the citizenry sometimes doesn't appreciate. That was a setback for us in terms of momentum. We are doing the best that we can, engaging on a voluntary basis, typically with these various parties. But the bottom line is that these are relatively low levels, in what we see across the Bay Area. And we are making our way through, as we have in the residents to the north, and confirming whether we have unacceptable indoor air quality. We haven't seen that yet to the north. And trying to confirm the existing buildings have we've confirmed that there's no acute exposures that require any sort of immediate action. So the community, from the available data we have, there is time to do the difficult, slow, iterative investigation work. There are no urgent, imminent health hazards that we've seen thus far because the levels are so low. We have sites where we have million plus microgram per meter levels in cell gas, and we see levels inside homes that require evacuation of the occupants. It's also not well appreciated that, the DTSC staff that you are working with, we have a special obligation that's placed upon us by the legislature. If we see chemical data that indicates an indoor air condition that poses an urgent health risk, we are statutorily obligated to report that to the county health department within 72 hours, even if that's over a weekend. If we saw that, we would be acting on it, but we haven't seen data that's urgent or acute. All of it is low-level, long-term, manageable type levels that allow time for a methodical, iterative research in what's going to be a difficult historical puzzle to kind of untangle in an urban setting. Vivek, I don't know if you had any other comments on kind of the risk landscape here or what you're seeing relative to other sites that you're assessing.
Not much further to add. Whit, you're speaking to a risk management framework. As the project toxicologist and risk assessor, I advise program on the actual quantitation of risk and what that number means, and inform whether you are above the point of departure for risk management decisions that triggers that yellow sort of decision framework or response actions. Just to be clear to the attendees how our roles are divided.
Right. Thank you, Vivek.
So Robert, I'm not sure I answered your question fully. I don't think I satisfied you in the response. I hear I hear your frustration with how slow the process is and how difficult it is for us to engage and move parties forward. It's a slow process, and we ask for your patience as we move through it.
All right. Speaking of patience, we're almost at 9 o'clock. It's been 2.5 hours, and it's clear that we need to engage more frequently with you so we can engage in more dialogue. And so we did, have a backlog of information to present, and we'd like to come back to you with just a Q&A session. And I will get back to the community and let you know what we decide. And before we close out, I just want to check again with Vila if we had any questions from Cantonese speakers so far. Vila, you want to switch over to the English line or shake your head so that's a no? Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
So Asha, if we get any late breaking questions from our Cantonese audience,
I can't quite hear you.
Oh, sorry. If we get any late breaking questions from our Cantonese audience members, we are capturing those in writing so we can get back to them, correct?
Yeah, and Vila hasn't gotten any questions from the Chinese line. Yeah. Well, thank you all for sticking with us for 2.5 hours. We have quite a number of questions, comments, and hands raised that we weren't able to get to. We apologize for that, but we're going to try and do better and create more opportunities for two-way dialogue. So thank you. We are going to be, continuing to do our investigations in the community, and we will try to issue more frequent updates so you don't have to, wait a whole year to see what we're up to. We'll aim for at least, I'd like to see if we can at least get out some regular updates, even in between meetings, just so you're aware of what's happening. And then if you have any ideas for us, please do let us know how we can better engage you if you have ideas. And as Whit mentioned, we do currently have a staffing shortage. So I think we can pick it up a little bit more once we've got another body to fill behind Arthur in place. So thanks so much for sticking with us. We're going to be out in the community, I think, until perpetuity, it seems like, because, with the land use covenant, we would be doing yearly inspections and reviews every 5 years. So we're going to be very active. And so we hope to be more of a presence and to engage with you more. So thank you all for joining us. And we hope to engage with you again before too long. Good night.